Have you ever really stopped to think about exactly where you came from? And I don't mean the town you grew up in or even the day you were born. I mean your very first biological spark. Well, prepare to have your mind bent just a little bit, because the truth is, you were an egg inside your grandmother. That's right. For a brief, incredible moment in time, you, your mother, and your grandmother all shared one single body. Okay, so here's how the biology actually works. When a female fetus is developing in the womb, right around the 5th month of pregnancy, her ovaries begin to form. And inside those ovaries are literally all the eggs she will ever carry for the rest of her life. So if your grandmother was carrying your mother, the egg that would eventually become you was already being formed inside that tiny fetus. Think about what that means. If your grandmother faced severe stress, extreme starvation, illness, or trauma during that exact window, those environmental shocks could directly alter the cellular makeup of her future grandchild. Yeah, you. Welcome to The Explainer. I am so excited to guide you through this topic today. We're going to transition from that spooky, mind-bending biological hook into a deeply structured real-life medical mystery. Today, we are unpacking intergenerational trauma and exploring exactly how our bodies keep the score of the past. We're going to look at the hard data, the biology, and the history to really understand how the pain of our ancestors might literally be living inside our cells right now. Let's start with Section 1, the grandmother effect, a biological inheritance.
And Section 2, the earthquake babies, scars of the unlived. Okay, let's dive into an impossible medical case that completely shifted how scientists view this.
So, if we accept that a grandmother's environment can physically alter the eggs her unborn daughter carries, we kind of have to accept that we are quite literally born from the womb of our ancestors' experiences. It means your biological inheritance isn't just, your grandfather's green eyes or your grandmother's thick hair. You might also be inheriting their deepest anxieties. In 1999, a massive 7.6 magnitude earthquake struck western Turkey. In just 37 seconds, the destruction was catastrophic. Over 18,000 people died, and 250,000 people were left homeless. It was an apocalyptic collective trauma. And then, just 3 months later, right as survivors were trying to heal, a second earthquake hit the exact same region. The psychological toll was just unfathomable. Researchers actually decided to track the young teenage girls who survived this horror, following their mental health over the next 2 decades. Fast forward 20 years later, those teenage survivors grew up, got married, and had babies of their own.
When doctors performed brain scans on those babies, who were born 20 years after the disaster, they found something absolutely shocking. These children had a physically altered brain structure, specifically a region of the brain called the amygdala, which is the part that manages our response to fear and danger. Well, it was significantly smaller than normal. These babies had never felt the ground shake. They hadn't even been conceived yet, but their tiny brains were wired for extreme panic, trapping them in this hyperstress state and making them highly vulnerable to anxiety and PTSD. The mother's trauma from 20 years prior had essentially written itself right into the child's brain architecture.
Moving on to Section 3, defining intergenerational trauma, echoes across generations. To make sense of what happened to those babies, we first need to define what we are actually looking at. Intergenerational trauma is basically a phenomenon where the psychological, emotional, and even physical effects of severe trauma transfer from the original survivors to subsequent generations. And it's important to note here that trauma in psychiatry is defined as an experience involving a threat of death, severe injury, or violence. So whether that trauma was deeply personal, like domestic abuse, or a massive collective trauma like a war, displacement, or a natural disaster, the biological echo remains long after the event ends. So what does this echo look like today? Well, descendants can experience a vast array of symptoms. We're talking severe anxiety, deep depression, extreme anger, a total inability to trust others, complex PTSD, intense social difficulties, and even higher rates of autism spectrum disorders. Imagine suffering from obsessive, intrusive thoughts or a constant defensive posture and having literally no idea why. What this research suggests is that a person's present suffering might not actually be theirs at all. It might belong to their ancestors' past. Let's look at Section 4, Echoes of History, a global phenomenon. If you're thinking that earthquake in Turkey was just some isolated, bizarre incident, it really wasn't. 10 to 19 times higher. That's a staggering number. And it comes from studies on Native American populations in the United States. They faced devastating displacement, war, and genocide over 400 years ago. Today, centuries later, their descendants suffer from suicide rates that are incredibly elevated, between 10 to 19 times higher than other young people living in the exact same country at the exact same time, but who come from different ancestral backgrounds. The historical trauma continues to physically and psychologically impact the present generation.
We see this pop up again in South Africa. Women who survived the extreme political, economic, and social trauma of the apartheid era over 70 years ago passed on a heavy, unseen burden. Studies show that when the children of these survivors reached adolescence and adulthood, they exhibited vastly increased rates of mental health disorders. The political trauma of the past mathematically and clinically translated into mental health crises for the next generation, long after the policies of apartheid had actually been dismantled.
Which brings us to Section 5, How Trauma Travels. Pain Becomes Biology.
So, we've got the evidence, right? We see these patterns globally. But as curious learners, we really have to ask the ultimate detective question. Exactly how does a memory of pain become biology? How does it physically jump from one generation to the next? Researchers currently point to 3 distinct pathways for how this transfer happens. First, the behavioral and observational pathway. Second, in utero nervous system changes. And third, direct genetic and DNA alterations. Let's break these down one by one so we can see the exact mechanisms at play here.
All right, the first pathway is behavioral. This happens when a new generation absorbs trauma through the stories they hear, the way they are parented by traumatized individuals, and their collective cultural identity. A profoundly clear example presented in the medical discourse is the Palestinian experience. For a child born into that environment, the collective trauma of their people isn't just history, it shapes their worldview, their awareness, and their fundamental identity right from the moment they open their eyes. The trauma is simply absorbed through the environment and the shared reality of the community.
Then we have the second pathway, and this is where we start seeing actual physiological changes inside the womb. Studies on women who suffered severe physical or psychological abuse in their own childhoods show something really startling. When these women eventually have children, their babies are frequently born with smaller gray matter in the brain and an overactive sympathetic nervous system. Basically, the baby's fight or flight switch is just jammed in the on position from birth. Their tiny bodies are flooded with rapid heartbeats and tension, permanently wired to anticipate a constant danger that they haven't even encountered yet.
Let's move to the third pathway, direct DNA and genetic alterations. In a really landmark study, researchers looked at pregnant women who survived the terror of the World Trade Center attacks on September 11th. When measured, the babies of those 9/11 survivors had abnormally low cortisol levels compared to normal babies. Cortisol is that essential hormone that helps our bodies manage stress. So this biological alteration meant these children were incredibly sensitive, becoming highly distressed by loud noises or unfamiliar faces. The intense trauma of 9/11 had literally altered the expression of genes in the mother's reproductive cells.
And finally, Section 6, breaking the cycle, healing future cells.
I know this is some heavy stuff, but understanding the science is the absolute first critical step to breaking the cycle. One of the biggest hurdles doctors face in diagnosing and treating inherited trauma is silence. Because of societal stigma, families hide heavy secrets out of fear or shame, leaving the next generation fighting a war with no medical history. Families will often bury the truth of domestic abuse, crime, violence, or intense shame. They sweep it under the rug just to protect themselves. But by doing that, the next generation goes to the doctor with crippling anxiety or depression, entirely unaware of their true background. They are fighting an invisible ghost. You just can't treat what you don't know exists.
There's also this cultural friction we really have to acknowledge. When we tell a community, whether it's a family or an entire nation, that they carry deep biological trauma, some feel it ruins their image of unwavering strength. But acknowledging psychological wounds does not weaken a community's resilience or erase their heroism. It simply grounds it in reality. It strips away that shiny, mythical veneer and reveals the very real, very human cost of survival. It says, yes, we survived, but we also bled, and we need to heal.
And that brings us to our final thought for this explainer. Our ancestors, who lived through wars, displacement, and abuse, rarely had the luxury, the safety, or the science to process their trauma. They just had to survive. But today, we have the awareness, we have the data, we have therapy, and we understand the biology of our pain. By looking bravely at our past and choosing to heal our own minds and bodies, we have the unprecedented power to protect our future selves. So the ultimate question I leave you with is this. Now that you know the score, will the cycle stop with you?